The years 1750 to 1900 are often called the Age of Revolution, and while there are many ways we could define the term revolution, for now let's just settle for a fairly straightforward one, the idea of armed insurrection by a group of people in an attempt to change and overthrow a government, whether successful or not. We're going to look at several examples of this over the next couple of weeks, and as we do so, it might be worthwhile to consider what conditions lead to revolution and just how bad those conditions need to be in order to justify the use of something as extreme as revolution. Today we're going to start with one that is perhaps the best known, at least to us, the one that we're fairly comfortable with, and that is the situation that became I would suggest to you that the American Revolution did not begin in the 1770s. As a matter of fact, I would suggest to you that the American Revolution didn't even begin in America. Rather, it began a couple of decades earlier in Europe, where there were intense rivalries, not only with things like mercantilism pitting nations against each other, think of the British Navigation Acts as an example, but even more so the instability within empires like the Holy Roman Empire, where the states of Prussia and Austria vied for who was going to have the influence and really control that particular empire. In 1756, Frederick the Great of Prussia found himself facing a potential alliance between his rival Austria, who was already allied with places like Russia and most notably France and Spain, and now the state of Saxony threatened to join that particular alliance, Saxony being another state of the Holy Roman Empire located in between Austria and Prussia. It was the fear of that alliance that prompted Frederick the Great to launch an attack on Saxony in 1756, which of course drove them right into the arms of Austria and created the very alliance he was afraid of. Looking for allies against that, who better to turn to than the enemy of France, and thus Austria, that would be Great Britain. And so Great Britain joined what became known as the 7 Years' War on the side of Prussia. From 1756 to 1763, this war was waged across Europe, but it didn't just stop in Europe. Indeed, it spread to various other parts of the world as well. In the colonies, where France and Britain were intense rivals, it became known as the French and Indian War, pitting the French colonies of places like Canada and the areas around the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys against the American colonies owned by Britain. The war also spread to places like India. Ultimately, this war was fought till 1763 to little real resolution, and so the parties got together in 1763 in the city of Paris, what better than the city of wine, women, song, and treaties, to negotiate a settlement to the 7 Years' War. Be careful, though, there's more than one Treaty of Paris. We're referring here to the one of 1763, the resolution of the 7 Years' War, but there are other treaties of Paris that we will be talking about in the next couple of weeks. The settlement was pretty straightforward in Europe. There were minimal changes in borders. Very little really was resolved by the 7 Years' War, at least within the scope of Europe itself. But there were much bigger impacts in places like the New World, where the French had not fared very well against the British army, and thus the British seized all of their possessions in the part of North America that became Canada and all of the territories east of the Mississippi River. That territory now became British territory. The other thing that Britain got out of this was some territory in India from the French, and perhaps most notably, more important than all of that, was a huge amount of debt. This had been an extremely expensive war to wage, and Britain found itself at the end of the 7 Years' War over 140 million British pounds in debt. That in today's dollars would be billions of dollars. And now there was a need to find some solution to that. And so King George III turned to his then finance minister, George Grenville, and demanded that he come up with some solutions that were going to allow the British to regain solvency and settle this debt problem. George Grenville was involved in this initially. He only lasted for a couple of years, but the plan that followed, even that put into effect by his successors, becomes known as the Grenville Plan. Grenville's major theory here was that everybody in the British Empire was benefiting from the situation. Everybody in the British Empire should be part of the solution. Indeed, he argued that since the colonies had gained a tremendous amount of territory, and since they needed the defense of the British military to protect them, they should bear some of the cost of settling this debt and the ongoing cost of maintenance. The first step in the Grenville Plan was his recognition that the protection of the newly gained territory from the French was going to be an extremely difficult and expensive proposition. In the first place, Britain is largely a naval power, and this was land that was west of the Appalachian or Allegheny Mountains, and therefore going to be very difficult to send troops to and protect it. Furthermore, there was going to be the need for a lot of protection because the Native Americans were not receptive to British control of this territory, and the residual French colonists were not likely to be loyal to the British either. Consequently, Grenville issued what became known as the Proclamation Line of 1763. What that said is that there would be no settlements allowed in territory west of the Appalachian Mountains. This means that all the territory that had just been gained from France was off limits to the colonists. All that territory was going to have to be left alone. That's a problem to many of the wealthy colonists who had been speculating in land, especially during the previous few years, and bought up land thinking that this was going to become extremely valuable. We're talking about people like George Washington, who had invested in land in Western Virginia and the area around Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or John Hancock, the wealthiest man in the 13 colonies. These gentlemen were Grenville also determined that he was going to have to raise money to pay for all of this, to defend the colonies and maintain this territory. And so he proposed taxation. Initially, he proposed something called the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act was designed to raise money for their protection, and what it did actually was lower the tax on molasses, molasses being the liquid form of sugar that was often shipped around the colonies. The tax was lowered from 6 pence per gallon to 3 pence per gallon, which makes it sound like this ought to be a pretty good thing. But the problem was that at 6 pence per gallon, the sugar tax was so high that it was never enforced. Nobody took it seriously. What Grenville was signaling with a 3 pence tax is that indeed the British were now going to enforce the act. They were going to collect that tax, and that is exactly what they tried to do. Furthermore, they said that they would enforce this using what are called vice admiralty courts. The word admiral is the key word here. What we're talking about is military courts to enforce the collection of the tax instead of civil courts. This would be a violation of the tradition of English law that guarantees a jury by your peers and so on, that dates back to the Magna Carta. And so the British colonists in America became intensely unhappy with the Sugar Act and began to form groups to rebel against that and find ways to circumvent it. One of the most famous of those groups is a group called the Sons of Liberty, headed by a gentleman by the name of Samuel Adams. Adams and the Sons of Liberty advocated boycotts of British products and other actions against the British in an attempt to get them to back down. The problem is that the tactics they used were pretty rugged, to put it mildly. For example, to enforce the boycott, those who bought from the British were subject to being tarred and feathered. That might sound kind of amusing and interesting, the idea of putting somebody in tar and then throwing feathers on them like a bird, but if you recognize what's really going on, it's not funny at all. Indeed, the way this happened is a person was stripped down and dumped in a vat of hot tar, which means their entire body was going to be burned. They were then extracted from that vat, and the feathers were thrown at them in an effort to make them look like a bird. If the person even survived the scalding that had occurred, the next problem would be to remove all that tar and feathers, and of course to do that they would either need abrasives or something like kerosene, all of which would be horrifically painful, if not out and out fatal to the individual, having been burned as badly as they would have been. So we're dealing with tactics here that would have been really tantamount in today's world to what we would call terrorism. The Sons of Liberty were in essence terrorists. Now, of course, there's the statement that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. You can decide for yourself how you want to interpret Samuel Adams. But this was what faced the British when they tried to enact the Sugar Act, and the result was that eventually they were forced to back down. Between the protests and the problems, it was costing the British more to enforce the law than they were actually collecting from it. And so they rescinded the Sugar Act and began to try other attempts. One of the next ones was one that became known as the stamp tax. This was a stamp that had to be purchased and placed on all kinds of documents and other household common goods, whether it be newspapers or marriage licenses or birth certificates and wills and so on. And so these stamps had to be bought and put on them, and in essence this was a way of raising money. It was this that James Otis was reacting to when he gave his famous speech decrying taxation without representation. That also didn't work, and so the British were forced to back down on that one in the face of the protests and so on, and instead they implemented something that became known as the Townshend Acts. Again, tariffs on everyday items of all sorts that resulted in a series of protests in a lot of places, most notably in the city of Boston, where a crowd basically marched down to the Customs House near Boston Harbor to protest the Townshend Acts, and the British troops there, facing a barrage of snowballs and dirty names, panicked and fired on the crowd, killing 5 individuals. Those 5 individuals were immortalized by Paul Revere and others as victims of a Boston massacre. Now, whether you really think that the death of 5 people by troops that were feeling threatened at the time qualifies as a massacre is perhaps open to interpretation. Townshend Acts were also eventually rescinded, and other acts tried instead. In 1773, the British Parliament enacted what became known as the Tea Act. The Tea Act was actually an interesting attempt to save the British East India Tea Company from bankruptcy. The tea company was failing, and so what the Tea Act did was put a tax on any tea that was imported to the colonies by any company except the British East Indies Tea Company. That company did not have to pay the tax, thus gaining a price advantage over anybody else. Why would Parliament do something like that? Because several members of Parliament were major stockholders in the British East Indies Tea Company, and this was their attempt to save their investment. Needless to say, it wasn't well received. The colonists in Boston in particular responded by dressing up in Native American garb and boarding a British freighter in the harbor and dumping a new shipment of tea that had just come into the harbor, otherwise known, of course, as the Boston Tea Party. The response to the Boston Tea Party was a series of actions taken by the British government to punish the people of Boston and Massachusetts. The people in Massachusetts called these pieces of legislation the Intolerable Acts, a pretty good indication of how they felt. The British were mincing no words, however, about what they thought either. The British called them the Coercive Acts, so it's clear that they were seeing these as fairly heavy-handed as well. What these acts did, basically, was to shut down Boston Harbor until the colonists paid for the shipment that had been destroyed. It further claimed that the presence of British troops to keep the city of Boston under control and in order was becoming so expensive that those troops would now have to be housed by the Bostonian citizens in their own homes and fed by them, thus quartered by them, and so it becomes known as the Quartering Act. The last thing that it did was to impose martial law over the entire colony of Massachusetts. And so